In 1954, when the world was in the grip of political tension and civil rights struggles, the FBI and the New York City elite decided they had had enough of Bumpy Johnson. They believed that by locking him away, burying him alive, they could finally remove Harlem's most infamous figure from the streets. But they didn't just lock him in a cell. They locked him in a concrete wall, burying him deep within the bowels of a prison system designed to break even the toughest of men. What they didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson wasn't a man who could be buried. Not by walls, not by chains, not by fear. 24 hours later, the FBI and New York's finest found themselves in shock as Bumpy was sitting at the mayor's table, eating dinner as if he had never left. This is the story of how Bumpy Johnson, buried alive by the system, rose from the ashes of his prison to reclaim what was his, and to remind the world that no one could ever take his place. No chains, no walls, no men in power could ever break Harlem's king. By 1954, Bumpy Johnson had become more than just a man. He was a legend. His influence stretched across Harlem and beyond, from his well-organized numbers game to his impeccable connections with the city's power players. To the people of Harlem, Bumpy was a protector, a man who had risen from the streets to become a symbol of resilience and survival. To the FBI and the political elite, Bumpy was a menace, a figure they couldn't control, a man whose empire represented everything they despised. Harlem's kingpin wasn't just dealing in numbers, he was dealing in power. And that power was a threat to everything the city's elite wanted to maintain. But for all the power Bumpy held, it wasn't violence that kept his empire strong. It was his ability to maintain respect from both the streets and the city's power brokers. He was a master strategist, using his mind, not just his muscle, to carve out a kingdom in Harlem. The FBI believed that if they could remove Bumpy, they would break the heart of Harlem itself. The authorities thought that by burying him alive in the concrete walls of a prison, they could silence the legend of Bumpy Johnson once and for all. But what they didn't understand was that Bumpy's empire wasn't built on walls. It was built on a code of respect, loyalty, and a mind that could never be caged. The FBI and the New York elite felt their grip on the city slipping. Bumpy had become untouchable, a figure whose influence reached from the deepest corners of Harlem to the highest offices in the city. His numbers game was a multi-million-dollar operation, and no one had been able to touch him, not even the federal authorities. They had watched for years trying to find a way to break him, and in 1954, they thought they finally had their chance. Their plan was simple: contain Bumpy Johnson. They would lock him away in a high-security facility, cut off his ties to the outside world, and break his spirit. They believed that once Bumpy was out of the picture, they could dismantle Harlem's resistance, stopping the underworld operations that had made Bumpy a force to be reckoned with. But what they didn't realize was that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a criminal. He was the heartbeat of Harlem, and his empire wasn't just built on illegal business. It was built on trust, loyalty, and the power of respect that radiated from him. To bury him in concrete wasn't to silence him. It was to send a message that would ripple across the streets of Harlem and beyond. For the authorities, this was a battle of control. But for Bumpy, this was more than just a battle for survival. It was about proving that no one could ever take what was his. And when they buried him alive, they sealed their own fate. The moral line had been crossed when they thought they could erase Harlem's king. Now, Bumpy Johnson's revenge would be swift and absolute. It started with the night Bumpy Johnson was captured. The FBI had planned their operation carefully, orchestrating the moment with military precision. The streets of Harlem were quiet that evening, the calm before the storm. Bumpy, who had spent decades avoiding the law, was finally taken in by an ambush. They moved fast, chaining him with 10 heavy shackles and throwing him into a van. His men never had a chance to act. The FBI's goal was simple: remove Bumpy and break his will. They transported him to a high-security facility, where they placed him in a cold, dimly lit basement cell, surrounded by concrete walls. The prison guards, under strict orders, locked him in, ensuring he could never escape. But Bumpy, ever the calm strategist, had already begun to plan his escape. He wasn't concerned about the chains or the concrete. He was concerned with what they thought they could control. While the authorities celebrated their capture, Bumpy used the time to assess, to wait, and to prepare for the moment when he would strike. They locked him in, thinking it would break him, but Bumpy was already free. The moment they thought they had captured him, he had already won. In those dark hours, as Bumpy sat alone in the concrete cell, his mind never stopped working. He knew what the FBI had in mind. They wanted to break him. They thought isolation would destroy his spirit. But Bumpy had faced worse before. Imprisonment was just another obstacle, another test of his resolve. Through the bars and the thick concrete walls, the word began to spread. Bumpy Johnson was in prison. At first, the news was met with disbelief. Harlem had never seen its king in chains. But Harlem wasn't ready to give him up. His people knew better. They knew that Bumpy wasn't just a man. He was the embodiment of Harlem's strength and resilience. As the hours passed, the city began to buzz with the realization that their leader was still untouchable. Through his network, Bumpy learned of the FBI's plans. He remained calm, strategizing, waiting for his moment. He knew that the longer they kept him locked up, the more vulnerable they became. They were making a fatal mistake. Bumpy's calculated reaction was as clear as it was simple. When they thought they had buried him, he would rise from the ashes of their arrogance. He would show them that Harlem's king could never be caged. The FBI and prison guards, feeling confident in their victory, grew more complacent as the hours wore on. They thought they had finally broken Bumpy, the man who had evaded them for so long. They didn't realize that their false sense of security would be their downfall. Bumpy, though trapped in a cell, was in complete control. His mind never stopped working, and his network never stopped moving. As the FBI celebrated their small victory, they didn't see the subtle shifts in the system. They didn't see Bumpy's plan unfolding. Bumpy wasn't just waiting for the right moment to escape. He was setting the stage for his ultimate return. He knew the FBI had become overconfident. They thought they had sealed him away, but Bumpy knew that nothing could keep him buried forever. They thought they were in control, but Bumpy was the one who held the real power. At exactly 6:00 a.m., Bumpy's escape plan was ready. Without firing a shot or making a sound, Bumpy's network had infiltrated every corner of the prison system. Prison guards who had once followed the warden's every command now found themselves taking orders from Bumpy's men. They opened doors, disabled security systems, and allowed Bumpy the freedom to move. Unseen, unheard. The FBI and prison authorities had no idea what was happening behind their backs. Their attention was focused on one man, but Bumpy was far more than just one man. He was a force that ran through Harlem's veins, and he had used every ounce of his power to prepare for this exact moment. The concrete walls that had trapped him were now the very walls that would witness his return. By the time the FBI realized what had happened, Bumpy Johnson was already on his way to the mayor's office, prepared to sit at the table and take his rightful place at the heart of New York City's power. It was exactly 24 hours after the FBI had sealed Bumpy Johnson in a concrete wall when he made his unexpected reappearance, not in the streets of Harlem, not in an underground lair, but sitting at the mayor's table, calmly eating dinner. The same authorities that had believed they had broken him, that had locked him away in darkness, were now forced to watch in disbelief as Harlem's most feared kingpin sat under the soft light of the mayor's office, enjoying a meal as if nothing had ever happened. The mayor, a man who had once seen Bumpy as nothing more than a criminal to be controlled, was now at the center of a storm. He had been part of the system that allowed the FBI to imprison Bumpy, but in the same breath, he knew the value of Bumpy's power in Harlem. The mayor was no fool. He understood the unspoken rules of the street. When Bumpy sat down at his table, the balance of power had shifted. The FBI, believing they had finally captured the heart of Harlem, had unwittingly handed Bumpy the perfect opportunity to show the world who really controlled the streets of New York. They believed that concrete walls and chains could contain him, but Bumpy had shown them that his true power lay not in brute strength or fear, but in his ability to outsmart and outlast anyone who stood in his way. The moment Bumpy entered the mayor's office, there was a tension in the air. The mayor, attempting to maintain his composure, offered a weak greeting. "You've got some nerve showing up here, Johnson," the mayor said, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. Bumpy took a slow breath, leaning back in the chair, his eyes steady, his face calm. He didn't need to say much. He had already won. The mayor, along with the FBI, had underestimated him. But Bumpy wasn't about to gloat. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here to show the world that the rules had changed. "I didn't think you'd be this comfortable in your chair," Bumpy said, his voice cool and deliberate. "I'm not here to make threats. I'm here to remind you that Harlem runs its own game, and you don't get to play without my say." For a moment, there was only silence, broken only by the clink of silverware as Bumpy took another bite of his dinner. The mayor, once so sure of his control, now found himself on the receiving end of the most disrespectful situation imaginable. He had once believed that the system he represented could control everything, but it was clear now that the game had always been in Bumpy's hands. The FBI, who had been watching from behind the scenes, couldn't believe what they were witnessing. They had buried Bumpy alive, and now, not even a day later, he was sitting at the mayor's table, dictating the rules of the game. The message was simple. No one was untouchable, and Harlem's king was back in charge. Bumpy's precise actions, his calm demeanor, and his ability to remain in control were the real weapons. He didn't need to raise his voice or throw punches to make his point. Instead, he used the power of presence, an unspoken authority that reverberated through every room he entered. As the night wore on, it became evident to everyone in that room that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a survivor. He was a man who had mastered survival itself. The mayor's unease grew with every passing minute as he realized the implications of Bumpy's presence. The power dynamics in the room had shifted, and he could feel it. No longer was he in control of the conversation. No longer was he the one with the authority. The tables had turned. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of silence, Bumpy stood up from the table. The room grew even quieter. "I'm not asking for anything," Bumpy said, his voice carrying a weight that made every word land like a hammer. "I'm just reminding you that Harlem isn't something you can control. You respect it, or you'll find yourself out of the game." The mayor, having no more words left to say, nodded solemnly. He knew better than to challenge a man who had outsmarted not just the FBI, but an entire system. And with that, Bumpy turned and walked out of the mayor's office, leaving behind a room full of men who had learned a valuable lesson. Harlem's king had returned, and those who tried to erase him had just sealed their fate. The aftermath of that night rippled through Harlem, through New York City, and through the ranks of the FBI. Bumpy Johnson, once locked in a concrete wall, had proven that no matter what the authorities threw at him, he would always find a way to rise. The power of respect had carried him through the darkest moments, and now his name was more legendary than ever before. For the mayor, this was a lesson in humility. Harlem had always been untouchable, and Bumpy Johnson was the embodiment of that spirit. The mayor's influence would never be the same again. He would always remember the night when Bumpy Johnson walked into his office, not as a prisoner, but as a king who could never be contained. For the FBI, the failure was one of the most humiliating they had ever faced. The fact that they had locked Bumpy Johnson in a wall and he still came out on top was a bitter pill to swallow. But the truth was simple. You couldn't break a man like Bumpy. He wasn't just a criminal to be caught and buried. He was the living embodiment of Harlem's pride. Bumpy Johnson's story isn't just about his rise to power. It's about the unshakable resilience of a man who refused to be silenced, even when the world tried to bury him alive. He showed the world that no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't erase Harlem's spirit. And they couldn't erase him. If this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Bumpy Johnson story's history forgot, the moments that made him a legend, the code that made him untouchable. Drop a like if you think Bumpy was the smartest man in Harlem. And in the comments, what would you have done if you were Bumpy Johnson in that moment? Would you have delivered justice the same way? More legendary stories coming next day. Don't miss it. The truth was simple. Bumpy Johnson had never been locked in that concrete wall. At least, not in the way the FBI thought he had been. While they had seen him as their final victory, Bumpy had already laid the groundwork for his own return long before they ever tried to shut him down. What they didn't realize was that when they buried him in that cold basement, they were planting the seeds for the inevitable confrontation that would leave them reeling. Bumpy knew what was coming when he first entered the warden's office. There was no anger in his step, no rush to escape. Instead, he had taken his time, assessing every detail, every movement. The moment Bumpy was in the mayor's office, sitting across from his would-be captors, he let them sweat. He didn't need to act quickly or aggressively. His calm was his weapon. The silence, the ease with which he moved, drove the point home. The FBI and the mayor's men had thought they'd won. They thought they had broken Harlem's kingpin. But now, as Bumpy sat at the mayor's table, enjoying the meal he had earned through sheer will and intellect, it was clear. This wasn't just a victory. This was Bumpy's claim to power once more. The authorities had thought they could lock him away, that they could bury the very soul of Harlem. Instead, Bumpy had risen like a phoenix from the ashes, unscathed, unbroken, and now more powerful than ever. And as Bumpy slowly placed his fork down, meeting the mayor's eye with quiet confidence, the truth dawned on them all. Bumpy had won. He wasn't just a survivor, he was a legend, Harlem's legend. And it was no longer just a kingdom that existed in the shadows. Now, the world would know that no one, no matter how much power they wielded, could ever defeat the unshakable will of Harlem's true king. The moment Bumpy stood up from the table, It was a declaration, a statement that reverberated far beyond the walls of the mayor's office, deep into the hearts of everyone who had ever underestimated him. With each calm step, he left behind not just a scene of dinner, but the symbolic end of an era where the powers that be thought they could control Harlem's fate. The mayor watched as Bumpy approached the door, his calm and confident demeanor not just a reminder of his resilience, but of the system's complete failure to crush his spirit. When Bumpy turned to face the mayor one last time, it wasn't with anger or bitterness, but with the quiet authority of a man who knew he had just reclaimed everything. "You thought you could break me," Bumpy said, his voice calm but cutting. "Thought you could lock me away in your concrete walls. But Harlem doesn't bend to anyone. It bends to those who earn its respect, and I've earned mine." With that, he walked out. The mayor, sitting there stunned, understood the lesson he had just been taught. Respect couldn't be purchased, and it couldn't be taken away. Bumpy's reign had never been about fear or power. It had always been about the trust and loyalty of the people who followed him. As Bumpy exited the building, the streets of Harlem could already feel his presence, not in the form of a man running from the law, but as a king returning to claim his throne. The FBI, the mayor, and everyone else who had tried to erase him now understood that the spirit of Harlem was untouchable, and Bumpy Johnson was the living embodiment of that spirit. The aftermath of that night was felt throughout the entire city. The FBI, once so certain of their victory, now had to face the cold reality. Bumpy Johnson could never be broken. The streets of Harlem buzzed with the news that their king had risen once more. Bumpy didn't just escape the concrete walls. He had become a legend, a man whose survival was more than just a triumph of will. It was a reminder that no system, no matter how strong, could suppress the soul of a community that refused to be silenced. The mayor, once a key player in the system that sought to control Harlem, now found himself in a position of humiliation. He had underestimated not just Bumpy, but Harlem itself. The streets that had once been a mystery to the elite now seemed even more untouchable. Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a force, and Bumpy Johnson had become its undisputed king once again. For the people of Harlem, this was a moment to celebrate. They knew that Bumpy wasn't just a symbol of survival. He was a symbol of resilience. His ability to outlast the authorities and return from the depths of their plans showed them that no matter what was thrown at them, they would never be silenced. Bumpy's story was no longer just one of crime. It was one of legacy, of a man who had fought for his place in the world and would never be moved by anyone's plans to take it away. The FBI and the mayor had tried to bury him, but they had only buried their own fate. Bumpy Johnson's story is a testament to resilience, a reminder that no matter how much the world tries to bury you, no matter how deep the walls they build around you, your spirit can never be contained. Bumpy proved that when you stand for something greater than yourself, when you fight for the respect of your people, you can never truly be defeated. If this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Bumpy Johnson story's history forgot. The moments that made him a legend, the code that made him untouchable. Drop a like if you think Bumpy was the smartest man in Harlem. And in the comments, what would you have done if you were Bumpy Johnson in that moment? Would you have delivered justice the same way? More legendary stories coming next day. Don't miss it.